Novelty might be the standard when it comes to gameplay and presentation with Nintendo, but when it comes to their stories, not so much. Every big Nintendo IP has a few outliers here and there, but for the most part, each of them has been following the same tried-and-true narrative formulas first laid down in the 80s and 90s. Not to say that that's inherently a bad thing, it's clearly working out well for them, but these franchises rarely break new ground with regard to storytelling. It's not as immediately obvious if the same could be said for Fire Emblem. Leaving aside that this series already bucks Nintendo's overall family-friendly image to revel in how shamelessly horny it is, Fire Emblem is at its core a series about war, which, comparatively speaking, is about as dark and messy as it sounds. There are elements at play that superficially temper that darkness, be it the wacky anime antics, the almost total lack of on-screen gore, or the aforementioned horniness, but it's nevertheless significantly heavier subject matter than you'd expect to see in the majority of other Nintendo IPs. But does dark equal complex? In this case, not necessarily. If you played more than one Fire Emblem, you'll start to notice a surprising number of recurring storytelling beats, ranging from broad narrative strokes to weirdly specific recycled elements that the fanbase identifies as archetypes and then proceeds to argue endlessly over. Character archetypes are one thing. It's pretty hard to miss how often in these games you get a pair of red and green knights, or a weak late joining unit trying to bait you into taking the time to raise them after all. But above all that is the odd reality that there is, in fact, a standard Fire Emblem plot. One that every mainline game in the franchise, bar one odd exception, follows to one extent or another. And we're not talking about a widely applicable monomyth either. There are some precise recurring bits here and there that one can trace all throughout the series. The hero's country gets invaded. They have to travel around the continent recruiting allies with the power of friendship. There's a larger supernatural threat lurking behind the mundane political one. There's dragons, there's legendary weapons, there's incest and miscellaneous other eyebrow-raising sexy bits. And then it's all tied off with something that feels like a happy ending, but is usually at least a little bittersweet about it. Ruminations on the cyclical nature of war and so forth. There are plenty of variations, like how sometimes there are two protagonists, or we get to see how we got there or what the fallout from such a story would be, or we get to play as the conquerors, but the essential outline remains the same for every Fire Emblem game not named Blazing Blade. But why does the standard plot work? And why does Intelligent Systems keep returning to it over and over instead of trying out a new war story every now and then? To help answer those questions, I think it's best if we take a look at the very first iteration of this familiar storyline, and how the writing of a Famicom game from 1990 continues to influence Nintendo's strangest moderately popular franchise even today. First, though, we should be honest with ourselves. I did not play Shadow Dragon when it was current, and I'd be willing to bet that no one watching this video did either. That would have required you to be alive in 1990 and able to access a video game sold only in Japan, and also literate in Japanese for that matter, since we're talking about the story here. Like the majority of Fire Emblem fans today, I was only exposed to FE1 in hindsight, initially via its rather underwhelming DS remake, and then later through the officially localized Switch port that was only available to purchase for a few months 4 years ago because Nintendo is weird like that. What this means is that it's quite difficult for me not to look at Shadow Dragon and compare it to Fire Emblem titles that came out decades later, as opposed to how it held up in the video gaming landscape of 1990. To consider its gameplay from a historical perspective, that it was arguably the first tactical role-playing video game, is tough enough since FE1 feels incredibly primitive to play even in contrast to the Super Famicom Kaga games. But its writing? Well, that's a whole other matter entirely. Video game plots in the 1980s were almost always the sort of thing you could easily sum up in one sentence, and often a very simple one at that. Nintendo's two biggest franchises to originate in that decade follow, in essence, the very same story. Man saves woman from monster. and to varying extents, they keep returning to that story game after game even today. Even Famicom JRPGs like the original Final Fantasy are remarkably bare bones in the writing department compared to how convoluted those games would infamously become in later decades. Shadow Dragon's script is not long by Fire Emblem standards. In fact, it might be the shortest one in the series depending on how you're counting, but it really sticks out when you look at other major titles released in the same year. Beyond the basic good versus evil narrative and the ending where you fight a monster, it's not actually that simplistic. There are shades of political nuance layered into FE1's war story, with sympathetic enemy nations and a self-serving former ally who turned on the heroes. The monster waiting at the end of the story has his own motivations that extend beyond conquest for its own sake, and along the way to him you can recruit sympathetic members of his race who add a bit more texture to this conflict between humans and dragons. There are little side dramas that play out amongst characters outside Marth's main group, including a love triangle that doesn't involve the hero in any way, and which ends up becoming the sequel hook. That bit right there also plays into what really sets the original Fire Emblem apart from the likes of Mario and Zelda. There are a lot of princesses in Shadow Dragon, and true to form for games of this time, most of them need rescuing. But the kidnapping that's foremost in Marth's thoughts is that of his sister, and neither the princess who plays the major supporting role in the main plot, nor the one who drives the smaller Macedon arc are his love interest either. Instead, Marth's girlfriend, who is yet another princess of course, shows up on the very first map to hand him his call to adventure, and then fight alongside him as he sets off to war. Sita is a fully playable character in her own right, and she fulfills an essential role in the player's recruitment efforts such that if you were to not use her, or worse, get her killed, you definitely feel it. In a modern game, that wouldn't really be worth pointing out, and it's easy to criticize FE1's relatively small number of female characters pigeonholed into a handful of specialized roles that would lay the groundwork for the series' long-standing commitment to gender-locked classes. But again, this was 1990. Recall that the big reveal at the end of the original Metroid is that the protagonist is a woman, and if you beat the game fast enough, you get to see her in a bikini. Casual sexism was just kind of a standard for video games at the time. The more things change and all that. But in that historical context, Shadow Dragon's handling of its female characters is actually pretty noteworthy. That can likewise be said for the game's world building, which juggles quite a lot for a script that doesn't even break the 10,000 word mark. Arcanea is by no means the most developed or diverse Fire Emblem setting out there, but most of its nations have their own subplots going on that establish their place in the world relative to Marth and Medius. FE1 also originates the common practice of fleshing out its game world through villager dialogue, helping the setting feel more lived in, and allowing it to seem as though Marth is traveling around Arcanea even in the absence of an in-game world map. Story progression follows along with that sense of motion, and with it you can get an idea of why the standard plot has stuck around in this series for so long. Low-stakes battles against bandits in the early game give way to clashes with the militaries of enemy nations, and for added flavor there's the larger threats of evil sorcerer Garneth, and of course the big bad dragon himself, Medius, waiting for Marth near the end of his journey. It's by no means the typical early video game excuse plot, and there's enough going on under the hood that the world of Arcanea was able to be expanded on in a sequel while still rehashing the same major plot beats. And along the way, there's the light suggestion of overarching themes, like the qualities of a good ruler and the far-reaching impact of war. Not too shabby for a Famicom game. Later Fire Emblems have done quite a bit to demonstrate just how malleable this formula can be. Bandits might be a low-stakes enemy, but they're a straightforward call to action that can quickly establish the leads as heroic types. Which is why, for example, the war in Isaac that kicks off FE4's plot happens entirely off-screen, whereas the game's beginning instead centers around Sigurd rescuing a damsel in distress, because it's not like Fire Emblem has ever tried to completely avoid that trope. Taking back one's homeland from invaders is also a much simpler sell than a war of aggression, if you're trying to keep audience sympathy primarily on one side. The first Fire Emblem to put the leads on the offensive from the beginning is Radiant Dawn, and that only happens around the game's halfway point when there's all of FE9 plus FE10's first two parts to establish why Benyon are the bad guys here. I don't think I even need to go into the two modern Fire Emblem routes that put the player in the Conqueror's role, because both of those are unsurprisingly controversial, both for the ethics involved and for the quality of their writing, since that perspective is very much not IS's usual thing. The same may be said of the franchise's biggest outlier, Blazing Blade, which doesn't even feature a war, and so has to make do by throwing a ludicrously overstaffed Assassin's Guild at the player instead. Oh, and also Artificial Humans, although FE7 is hardly the only game to go with monster enemies to fill out their less plot-heavy moments. Dragons in Fire Emblem, on the other hand, are rarely your run-of-the-mill fantasy enemies, but rather occupy a variety of roles in these stories as outsiders who can touch on themes of assimilation, cooperation, and of course racism. That's not to say that some of these other series I brought up have never tried anything similar, but those have been comparatively recent developments, and have been handled more unevenly, whereas the complexity of Fire Emblem's dragons was being hinted at back in 1990. Then there's the spicier elements, which if nothing else do help the franchise stand out from other fantasy properties purely on shock value, truly like an anime Game of Thrones in that regard. And in the present, they've certainly contributed to IS's success in the mobile gaming market, for better or worse. Coming back to Shadow Dragon 35 years later is never going to replicate the experience of playing FE1 in 1990, but it can help you appreciate the later games and all the ways that they've experimented with the formula and kept it feeling at least somewhat fresh, to the point that unlike most other Nintendo IPs, you do actually have to make a case for almost all Fire Emblem games sharing the same basic plot. Personally, I find this approach to looking at these games more interesting than considering each of them in a vacuum, not to mention more accurate to the design element that Fire Emblem shares with all long-running Nintendo franchises: shameless nostalgia bait. That's useful for looking forward to future games too, because IS is good at writing this one particular story and has absolutely no qualms about returning to it over and over again. Heck, one of my more unusual observations about Engage is that it essentially ditches the standard plot after the first arc in favor of a magical MacGuffin hunt, which fits better with the game's flashy, lighthearted tone than trying to follow up on the dour war story angle it was teasing before that point. Fire Emblem's writing is flexible enough to encompass multitudes, from the serious to the goofy to the unapologetically filthy. But what variations on the Fire Emblem standard plot have you enjoyed the most? And what would you like to see out of it in future games? Talk about it in the comments, and be sure to like and subscribe for more Fire Emblem content. I've got a handful of ideas exploring 3 houses on the way over the upcoming months, so hopefully you'll stick around and check those out. Thanks for watching, everyone. Au revoir,